what I'm discussing today draws from my book Militant Minority, as well as from some other research, and it's very timely. I think the ideal of working class emancipation and the struggle for socialism and against capitalism is once again on the political agenda for the first time in a generation, as the global Occupy movement demands fundamental changes to the world's financial and economic structures. As we work today to build a 21st century version of socialism, we can draw from a deep tradition right here in BC of the struggle for working class emancipation. The goal of a world without bosses, where resources are owned and controlled by the people, where solidarity and equality shape economic relationships. So this first slide is from a place that no longer exists called Camp Woodsworth, which was located on Gabriola Island, and it operated in the 1940s and 1950s. The socialists in this photograph belonged to the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF, forerunner to today's NDP. And they believed in a different kind of world. But they favored making these changes through the political system, winning a majority of people to a socialist point of view. Their goal was, quote, to make socialists through a long process of education. More radical political alternatives, such as communism, according to the CCFers, aimed for a shortcut that did not exist. To try to build socialism without majority support among the people was both impossible and also anti-democratic, according to the CCF viewpoint. At Camp Woodsworth and in other fora, these democratic socialists nurtured an independent left-wing culture, which provided respite and a sense of belonging in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile in the face of the emerging Cold War. Here's a quote from one CCF leftist, Dorothy Gretchen Steeves, who was the second woman elected to BC's legislature from North Vancouver, and she was vice president of the CCF in the late 1940s. And she said, quote, "The present anti-communist drive will become a drive against any organization and individual which threatens their vested interests, and that means the CCF." What Steeves was talking about was how the hysteria of anything remotely related to socialism or communism would be cast with one indiscriminate brush, and how all sectors of progressive opinion were being marginalized as the world polarized between the US-led West and the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc. So the rising anti-communist tide of the 1950s cut heavily into CCF support. In 1952, the liberal and conservative parties were relegated to the political sidelines. For the first 50 years of the 20th century, they had enjoyed a monopoly on power in this province. They had formed a coalition throughout the 1940s to keep the CCF out of power. Well, that coalition fractured, and it was a third party of the right, Social Credit, rather than the third party of the left, the CCF, that took power out of the ashes of the coalition. Social Credit was led by a hardware merchant, a member of the petty bourgeoisie named W.A.C. Bennett, and Bennett promised BC's working class the good life, short of CCF socialism. So this to Bennett meant economic security and high incomes, which would be provided during what was called the province building era, the era of high modernism, the era of an expanding global capitalism. It was a period when capitalism could provide a modicum of economic security for workers in the most advanced Western states, often off the backs of workers in what were then called the third world countries. We're no longer in that phase, it seems, and now capitalists in our country and beyond have taken the gloves off. But for a period, the bourgeoisie was prepared to make some concessions to working people in this province and beyond. The message of Social Credit resonated with a substantial layer of British Columbians, and Bennett was re-elected 7 times. But there was a militant minority of workers who refused these appeals, who saw beyond the luster of Social Credit messaging. They took aim at private control of BC's resource wealth and increasingly American ownership of the province's forest, fish, and hydroelectric resources. This poster, distributed by the Communist Party of Canada, reads, "Stop the U.S. grab of BC's Columbia Hydro. Stop the export of jobs." Another communist poster urged, "Develop BC for its people. Block the U.S. takeover." And this resonated with a message the CCF had been promoting since the 1940s. The radical character of the CCF is apparent from this quote by party president Colin Cameron, who was British-born, and he ended his career as the Member of Parliament for Nanaimo. To his very death, he described himself as a Marxist. According to Cameron, there must be no doubt in the mind of any CCF member that the first task of a CCF administration will be the swift and ruthless removal of the major sources of wealth production from private hands to those of the community. It must be made clear that all our program of social services and economic expansion rests upon that first bold revolutionary act. So Colin Cameron, Dorothy Steeves, and other leftists in the CCF viewed their politics as no less revolutionary than the socialism of the communists, but they saw themselves as pursuing this transformative agenda through democratic means. Across BC throughout the 1950s and 1960s, working class people gravitated behind an alternative working class worldview. They organized themselves into unions, often communist-led, to win a larger share of the province's resource wealth. This group of fishers at Duncanby Landing on remote Rivers Inlet on the Central Coast voted to hold their first ever industry-wide fishing strike in 1959, a year marked by major disputes of civil servants, woodworkers, and ironworkers. Even in the bleakest days of the Cold War, the Communist Party controlled the leadership positions of BC's second, third, and fourth largest unions: the Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers, the United Fishermen and Allied Workers, and the Vancouver Shipyard Workers. And communists also controlled locals such as the Vancouver Civic Workers and locals of electrical workers, tunnel and rock workers, hospital workers, woodworkers, and even some teachers' locals later in the 20th century. The communists often encouraged the organization of working class women in these red unions into auxiliaries, such as this auxiliary of the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union. They sought to extend the independent working class culture, the independent working class worldview beyond male wage earners to include women who managed the household economy and who just a few years later would move en masse into the ranks of the paid labor force. The militant minority focused on domestic issues, on wages, on working conditions, on safety for workers, and on social programs, but they also focused on international events. This demonstration, which appears on the cover of the book, is a a Trade with China march, which took place in front of the BC legislature in the 1950s. Today, trade with China is on the one hand controversial for leftists, given human rights violations in that country, and it's also commonplace. Probably 3/4 of us in this room or more are wearing Chinese-made goods, in whole or in part. But in the 1950s, it was a radical stance to urge that Canada and the other capitalist states should trade with the communist regime. The militant minority also spoke out in support of liberation movements in what was then called the Third World, such as Fidel Castro's July 26th movement, which had toppled the US-backed Batista regime. And the members of the militant minority traveled to these rogue socialist states, to Cuba, to the Soviet Union, to other Eastern Bloc countries, and to Red China. This photograph depicts a communist fisherman from Victoria, Elgin Scotty Niche, along with his socialist feminist wife Gladys, and the Cuban president Fidel Castro in the early 1960s. By the 1960s, the character of BC's left was changing. These old left groups, the CCF and the Communist Party, were suddenly joined by thousands of young people, students, and members of the urban middle class. So this was the transition from an old left to a new left. This demonstration, which included about 3,000 people, wound its way through downtown Vancouver in 1966, protesting American imperialism in Vietnam. And the rise of this new left, which was perhaps most visible in the peace movement, was also reflected by an upturn in militancy within the labor movement. Here we see a tense clash between RCMP officers and striking oil refinery workers at the British American refinery on Burrard Inlet in Burnaby in 1965, in an oil workers' strike that nearly escalated into a province-wide general strike. The struggle of these private sector workers in the 60s were given energy by the organization of new groups of workers who had never belonged to unions before, and also by the affiliation of groups of workers into the mainstream of labor. This banner was flown by plane over the provincial legislature by the BCGEU, which a year earlier had changed its name from the BC Government Employees Association to the BC Government Employees Union, reflecting a self-recognition among civil servants of their role as part of the organized working class. It's addressed to the provincial secretary, the top civil servant, Edwin Black, as a part of civil servants' campaign for collective bargaining rights. So by the late 1960s, new groups of workers, public sector workers, women, and office workers were joining the ranks of organized labor here in BC. In 1972, this constellation of social movement struggle and worker protest culminated in the defeat of Bennett's social credit regime and victory for the NDP, the first time a labor-aligned party had formed the BC government. Social worker Dave Barrett, depicted on the top row in the center, was elected premier. And while his government fell short of the expectation of many militants, even angering sections of the labor movement with back-to-work legislation, Barrett had done what few leftists have ever done in this province: seized the levers of the provincial state from the bourgeoisie. So to move towards a conclusion, as we meet here today in the early 21st century, with BC workers continuing to struggle, such as these teachers and their allies who struck illegally for 2 weeks in 2005, we can learn from this history. It is easy to be cynical about the prospects of the working class attaining political power, but state power has been one of the most formidable barriers to social movement struggle and to working class emancipation. To act on the vision of the global Occupy movement and to build an economy grounded in the ideals of solidarity and equality, we must, quote, be the state. I don't think a world without states is practical at this point in time, so the challenge is whether social movements continue to cede the state to the bourgeoisie or form organizations to allow to put the organs of state power within the hands of those social movements. Learning from history, this political struggle alongside the Occupy movement should, I've got a few bullets here, convey an alternative vision of how resources can be managed, controlled, and distributed, as we saw in my preceding discussion. I think the struggle needs to be rooted within the economic organizations of the working class. So to date, we've sort of seen the struggle for various social movements, whether oriented around race, gender, anti-poverty, peace. They seem to often operate at arm's length from the trade union movement, but I think we can learn from the strength of those movements acting hand in hand. This political struggle that we have today, I think, has to provide alternative cultural spaces, such as this one, that the organizers have created, to provide, I think, a sense of belonging and a sense of grounding in an otherwise soulless world that capitalism seeks to reproduce. And finally, I don't think we can ignore the hard and difficult question of forging political parties, perhaps strengthening existing parties, however messy and difficult that task may be, so that we can fulfill that goal of making socialists out of the 99% and create a world that we can all be proud of. So thank you very much.